When transferring your assets between two different applications, such as the case here where we're going to be using 3ds Max and transferring this architectural scene into Unreal, you have to first make sure that you have set up your unit measurement system or the scaling of your object, as well as the coordinate system for the orientation of those objects to match Unreal's system as closely as possible. So Unreal uses the metric system where 1 centimeter is equal to 1 Unreal unit, whereas 3ds Max uses kind of a generic unit system. Now bear in mind, however, that in 3ds Max you do have a lot of options for adjusting the scale, but some of those options do not actually affect the scale, they simply affect the view of the measurement system. So if we go into Customize and then Unit Setup here, we can see here this display unit scale, which is currently set to US standard feet. We're going to change that to metric centimeters. But honestly, this doesn't have any bearing on exporting the assets into Unreal. This is purely for demonstration in Max so that you can basically work in the metric system as far as the measurements that will be displayed in the modifier panel and whatnot. So if we go into the system unit setup here in 3ds Max, this will allow us to choose what units to use for our scene scale. So if you're working on a new project that you plan to send to Unreal, it would be best to set your system units in centimeters from the get-go. So we'll just change it here to from inches to centimeters. As an author, you may, however, be provided with scan data or assets created in another package. In this case, you should proceed with caution when changing the scale of the scene, as this could introduce some scaling-related issues. One option you have is to set Max to use centimeters, then load the scene that uses another unit scale, and choose to rescale the file objects to the system unit scale. Verify everything looks good using a simple stand-in object to represent a human at roughly 175 centimeters tall. You could also try using the Rescale World Units utility in 3ds Max. Use a scaling factor of 2.5 to go from feet and inches to centimeters. And finally, another option is to simply manually scale every asset in the scene. Now this is obviously not the easiest way to do this. If your scene is in feet and inches, then you'll need to scale all your assets by a factor of 2.5 or 250%. Of course, you should do this after you have set your scene's working units to centimeters. Now, regardless of which method you choose, you're going to want to reset the transform on all the scaled objects, and this will bake those changes in. Now, a few things to keep in mind when working with very large scenes. In this case, we have kind of a medium-sized interior architectural scene, but sometimes you might be working with an entire building, maybe a high-rise, an apartment structure, or even an entire city block or more. When you're working with those really large scenes, bear in mind that the further an object in your scene is from the origin of the world, that is 0, 0, 0, there are more chances for rounding errors in the math that is needed to display those objects accurately and without any kind of graphical glitches in Unreal. This can also happen with scenes that are extremely small. So for instance, if you have really small details, such as these books here and magazines and any other doodads that we have back on the shelves back here, if there are any of these details or any details on these objects that are smaller than the standard unit inside of 3ds Max or whatever package you're using, that can lead to glitches as well. So to avoid this as much as possible, be sure that your scenes are roughly centered on the origin of the world at 0, 0, 0, and avoid creating those assets or details on those assets that are smaller, again, than one generic Max unit, basically. Or in this case, we're using centimeters, anything smaller than a centimeter, for scaling your assets on export and import. Now, you have multiple options for export. You can export options one at a time. You can export the entire scene. You can use FBX export. You can use Unreal's Datasmith. And we are going to cover most of that later on in the course. But for now, just understand that you have those options. And we're going to look at FBX export first for a single asset and what you can do to scale the object. Now, bear in mind that it's best to avoid this type of what I call one-off scaling, and instead fix the assets in Max so that they're the right size. Have your entire scene created in the first place in the correct size. If you can do that, that's even better. But if you don't do any of those things and you do need to scale your assets, let's look quickly at some of the options you have. So here we have this mesh here that we're going to export, and we'll just go to File Export, and we'll choose our FBX file format. All right. And so if we look in the advanced options of FBX export, normally this is checked by default, this automatic option here. And the scale factor we can see here is set to 1. So it's not going to be scaled at all when it gets sent over to Unreal. If you need to change that here, you can just uncheck the automatic, and we can change our scene units. Since we're set up correctly here in centimeters, we could make this meters. We can see when we do that, the scale factor becomes a 1/100th of what it currently is. We could also go to kilometers or inches or whatever the case may be. But again, we're already set up correctly here. And again, I advise against doing this kind of scaling. You want it to be correct in the source asset, and that way when it does export into Unreal, it will be the same size. Everything will match exactly as you expect it to without doing this kind of one-off scaling. So now when we're in Unreal here, we can do the same thing with the import options. So go ahead and import that FBX file. And we can see here we have a couple of options. Under Transform, we have this Import Uniform Scale. We can basically scale up the asset here. Just type in the value we want to scale it by. Maybe we need to scale it by 10. We could do that. And we can also, under Miscellaneous, you can see here we have this basically Convert Scene Unit. We can convert the FBX units. Maybe we're working in max generic units. We can convert those into the Unreal Engine 4 centimeter units. Now again, avoid doing this kind of one-off scaling. It's best to fix it in the source material, and then when you export it, it will come in the right size. In this case, our scene here, go ahead and cancel this because we've already got everything imported. This scene here is exactly set up the way it should be because it was set up as centimeters and max. It came over as centimeters, and so everything is perfectly scaled already for us. With Datasmith, all of this is done for us. So if I go ahead and give you a quick sneak peek of the Datasmith exporter here, if we go to File, Export again, and in this case, we're going to choose the Unreal Datasmith format here, Viz Interior. So here we could, obviously choose just the selection or visible objects, and that's it. Those are our options. So when we hit OK, it's just going to send it out whatever size it was, but Datasmith does a great job of interpreting all the data so that it comes out in Unreal the way Unreal likes it. Datasmith was designed to be very simple to use, one-click workflow basically to bring all of your assets in. You can bring entire scenes in at once. And the great thing is it does all this magic in the back end that basically translates everything into the proper format for Unreal. Now, as for alignment or the coordinate system, Unreal uses a left-handed Z-up coordinate system, while 3ds Max and some other packages use a right-handed system. Now, this isn't a huge problem. Generally, when you bring your assets into Unreal Engine, they're going to be facing in the correct direction, and the top will be up and the bottom will be down and so forth. But there is a possibility, based on your import options, that your asset might come in rotated by 90 degrees, I believe, counterclockwise. And there is a way to solve that to make sure that your assets are matching identically inside of 3ds Max as well as inside of the Unreal Engine when you import. So let's take a quick look at how you can ensure that. So what we're going to do here is I have my fireplace selected inside of 3ds Max. I'm going to export 2 versions of that so that we can have 2 test cases to look at. And we'll just go ahead and export it once. So export selected. And I'm not going to change any of the default options here. We're going to leave scale factor to automatic. Axis conversion, the default there is Y up. We'll go ahead and leave that. And I'm going to export it one more time. And we'll just name it number 2. Same settings, no change here. I could probably use the same FBX file to re-import it twice to show you the same thing, but I wanted to go ahead and have 2 different versions that we could bring in at the same time. If we go into our 4-up view, we can see our fireplace here in the front viewport. That's our front viewport, top right. And again, if we look in the top viewport here on the left, we can see the fireplace here facing down into the room. So we know for sure that this should be facing forward. All right, so let's go ahead and import it into our scene here. This is the fully imported scene already. Everything is the correct size and facing in the correct direction. But just for a quick test case, we'll go ahead and re-import the fireplace. We'll start with the first version here. Now, under miscellaneous here, we have our 3 options that we're going to be looking at. We have convert scene, and this basically converts the scene into the UE4 coordinate system. Again, that's the left-handed Z-up coordinate system from whatever's in the FBX file, which is, in this case, a right-handed coordinate system using 3ds Max. And we'll go ahead and check that. And we're going to also check force front x-axis. And we'll keep that, convert scene units to centimeters, and we'll go ahead and hit import. And let's just drop them into the scene, and you can see right away something's not right. It's the right size, but it's facing 90 degrees. That would be counterclockwise, actually, and that's not what we want. So we'll go ahead and delete that, and we're going to re-import. And actually, we're just going to import the second version that I exported. And this time, the only difference is we're going to uncheck this force front x-axis and import that guy, drop him into the scene. And now we can see that this guy here is facing the correct direction and is the correct size. All right. So that's really all you need to do to make sure that when you're importing your assets using the FBX import option, to make sure they're facing in the same direction as they are in 3ds Max, make sure you check that option, that force front x-axis. Again, with Datasmith, you're not going to need to do that. It's going to do it all for you automatically. And, of course, you're going to get to bring in every asset in the scene. And we'll talk about that when we get to that part of the course. Working in the correct unit scale and in the correct coordinate system or alignment is the first step to ensuring the data in your Unreal scene matches the source data in your 3D tool, whether that be 3ds Max or Maya or Blender or whatever other tool you might be using. It will also help you avoid graphical glitches in the final walkthrough when you follow some basic rules about asset positioning and the size of your world in relation to the world origin. Remembering, the further away your assets are from the world origin, the more chance there is for graphical glitches due to the lack of precision when things get really far away from the center of the world. So it does take a little work to set up, but it's very important to do so when preparing your data. And a little effort here can go a long way toward creating an organized and high-fidelity experience in the end. Up next, we'll dive into a few of the most common ways to export your assets to Unreal.